When a former royal walks onto a live television stage opposite Britain's sharpest tongue, the outcome is rarely quiet. But on this night, what unfolded was not merely awkward or tense, it was explosive. This was the moment many would later describe as the night charm met defiance, and charm blinked first. What began as playful banter slowly curdled into a clash of egos so raw that even seasoned producers backstage sensed something slipping beyond control. By the end of the night, viewers would be left stunned, asking whether they had just witnessed the unthinkable. Graham Norton pushing a guest off his show. The iconic set of the Graham Norton Show glowed beneath its familiar purple and crimson lights, as polished and inviting as ever. The curved red sofa gleamed under the studio lamps, a throne of comfort that had hosted everyone from Hollywood legends to political heavyweights. Laughter rippled easily through the audience as the cameras rolled, and Graham spun around in his chair, flashing that mischievous, boyish grin that had disarmed guests for years. The mood was buoyant, expectant. Everyone knew they were in for an entertaining night. After all, the guest was Meghan Markle. Few public figures in recent memory had managed to command such relentless attention. Fired, criticized, defended, condemned often all at once. Had become a lightning rod for public opinion. Graham adjusted his cufflinks with exaggerated flair, milking the pause just enough before announcing, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Meghan Markle." The applause came quickly, but it wasn't thunderous. It was polite, cautious, edged with curiosity. Meghan emerged from backstage in a form-fitting emerald green dress that caught the light beautifully. Her hair fell in immaculate waves over her shoulders, every detail carefully composed. Her heels clicked sharply against the stage floor, the sound echoing between beats of applause. She smiled, lifted a hand in a poised, almost ceremonial wave, and moved with the confidence of someone long accustomed to being watched, as Graham rose to greet her. Offering the customary air kisses, he said warmly, "Meghan, wonderful to have you here." "Thank you, Graham. Lovely to be here," she replied, her tone smooth but cool. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the cameras as if checking her framing, before settling back on him. From the very beginning, there was tension. Not the nervous kind, not the flutter of a guest unsure of herself, but something sharper, something deliberate. It felt as though two people had arrived already, braced for a contest neither intended to lose. Meghan seated herself on the infamous red sofa, crossing her legs with precision, hands folded neatly in her lap. Graham wasted no time slipping into his trademark banter, the kind that usually softened guests before drawing them into laughter. "So, Meghan," he said lightly, "the whole world seems to have something to say about you lately. You're practically keeping half the British tabloids in business. Is that the plan? Stimulate the economy single-handedly?" The audience laughed, relieved by the familiar rhythm. Meghan's smile, however, barely reached her eyes. "Well, Graham," she replied evenly, "I wouldn't expect you to understand the complexities of living your life under constant attack. But I wouldn't call it stimulating the economy. More like feeding vultures." Ripple of surprise moved through the room. Graham chuckled, but his eyebrow twitched almost imperceptibly. "Oh, good heavens," he said, keeping his tone light. "Feeding vultures? Surely you've had your share of choice words, too. Interviews, a book, a Netflix series. You've given them plenty to chew on." Meghan tilted her head, a faint smirk touching her lips. "I'm sorry, Graham. Is this your show or their show? Are you here to interview me or just regurgitate tabloid nonsense?" This time the laughter was nervous, scattered. Graham's grin tightened, though he leaned back, clasping his hands over his knee with practiced ease. "Oh, I assure you, Meghan," he replied, "these are my questions. I admit they're probably what everyone watching at home is dying to hear." "Well," she said crisply, "perhaps you should think about asking better questions." The temperature in the studio dropped. What had been cheeky sparring now felt openly confrontational. Producers exchanged glances behind the cameras. The audience shifted in their seats. Subtle jabs gave way to unmistakable hostility as Meghan's composure hardened and Graham's patience began to thin. You could feel the air tighten with every exchange. Meghan's sharp, defensive responses collided with Graham's legendary wit, sparks flying with each sentence. He took a measured sip of water, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he set the glass down. "So, Meghan," he said smoothly, his voice calm but firmer now, "you've always championed honesty and openness. Let's be honest then. Do you ever regret leaving the royal family, or is everything exactly as you planned?" For a moment, Meghan said nothing. Her lips tightened, her jaw setting as though she were choosing her words carefully, or restraining them. The pause stretched, long enough to make the audience hold its breath. "Regret?" she finally said.
Yeah.
"That assumes I was ever given a real choice. What people call leaving was survival." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Graham nodded slowly, but his expression had shifted. The playful host was gone, replaced by someone sharper, more direct. And yet he said millions of people would say survival looks remarkably glamorous from the outside. Meghan's eyes flashed. Millions more would say you have no idea what it costs. Silence followed, not the comfortable silence Graham often used for comedic effect, but a heavy one, dense with unresolved tension. In that moment, the clash became unmistakable. This was no longer an interview. It was a standoff. Graham leaned forward slightly, his voice low but controlled. "This is a talk show, Meghan, not a courtroom. If every question is an attack, there's not much conversation left to have. And if every question lacks respect," she shot back, "there's no point in staying." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Cameras rolled. The audience sat frozen. And for the first time in years, Graham Norton didn't smile. That was the moment viewers would replay again, and again the instant win. Britain's most unflappable host met a guest unwilling to bend, in the easy magic of late-night television. Fractured under the weight of pride, perception, and two very different ideas of control. "I regret trusting people who didn't deserve it," Meghan said finally, her voice steady but edged with something raw. "But leaving? Absolutely not." The words landed with confidence, practiced yet forceful, as if she had rehearsed them. Many times before, Graham studied her for a brief moment longer than usual, the silence stretching just enough to feel deliberate. Then he leaned forward, resting one elbow on his knee, his posture no longer playful, but intent. "You say that quite convincingly," he replied. "So, some might say you've made a career out of walking away from obligations." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the audience. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Meghan's head snapped toward him, her smile vanishing instantly, replaced by disbelief edged with anger. "Excuse me?" she said. "Is this how you treat all your guests, Graham? Or is this just for me?" "No," he replied smoothly, allowing his trademark smirk to creep back onto his face. "Just the special ones." Meghan laughed, but there was no warmth. In it only a brittle sound that echoed awkwardly across the studio. "Well, I suppose you have to provoke someone to make good television," she said. "Is that what you're doing here? Because this feels less like an interview and more like very bad therapy?" A few nervous chuckles scattered through the audience, unsure whether to laugh or brace themselves. Meghan wasn't finished. She shifted forward slightly, her composure sharpening into something colder. "You know, Graham," she continued, "for someone who thrives off other people's stories, you're surprisingly bad at listening to them." The shift was immediate. Graham's eyes flashed, the humor draining from his expression. The host, who usually guided conversations with charm and irony, now looked unguarded, almost irritated. "Oh, I listen just fine, Meghan," he said calmly. "I just happen to know when a story is a performance instead of reality." "That did. It." Meghan straightened in her seat, her shoulders squaring, her voice hardening. "Performance?" she repeated. "Are you implying that my life is some kind of act?" Graham tilted his head slightly, as if considering the phrasing. "Oh," he said lightly, "you are an actress." The studio erupted, not in applause, but in a chaotic mix of gasps, nervous laughter, and shocked murmurs. Even the band in the corner exchanged uneasy glances, sensing they were witnessing something veering dangerously off script. Meghan's cheeks flushed crimson, her jaw tightening as she fought to maintain control. You know what? She shot back, her voice rising just enough to bounce off the studio walls. At least I know who I am. I'm not hiding behind a desk. Making snide remarks about other people because I'm too afraid to take risks myself. A stunned silence followed. Graham's mouth twitched into a thin, restrained line. His hands clasped tighter, knuckles whitening just slightly. Well, he replied evenly. At least I don't mistake victimhood for courage. Oh. The room froze. It was the kind of line that stopped time, the kind that people would quote online within minutes. Meghan blinked at him, genuinely stunned for a heartbeat before the familiar mask of poise slid back into place. You really think you're clever, don't you? She said. Sitting up here every week, mocking people's pain for ratings. Better. Then monetizing it, Graham fired back without missing a beat. The audience collectively inhaled, the tension now crackling like static electricity. Producers shifted behind the cameras. Someone in the front row covered their mouth. This was no longer entertainment, it was confrontation. Meghan leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Graham's with startling intensity. Careful, Graham, she hissed, her voice low but dangerous. You're crossing a line. Graham didn't look away. So are you, he replied. But the difference is, this is my show. The words landed with unmistakable authority. For the first time, Meghan hesitated. The power dynamic had shifted, subtly but decisively. The audience sensed it too, sitting rigid, afraid to breathe. This was supposed to be a conversation, she said, forcing calm back into her tone. Not an ambush. And it was, Graham replied. Until you decided every question was an insult. She shook her head. You invited me here knowing exactly what you were going to do. I invited you here because you wanted to be heard, he said. Being heard doesn't mean being protected. Another pause. At the studio. Lights felt harsher now, less flattering. Meghan glanced briefly toward the audience, then back to Graham. You know what? She said quietly. I don't need this. Graham raised an eyebrow. No, she repeated. I've spent years being dissected, misrepresented, and judged by people who don't know me. I won't sit here and let you do the same, under the guise of humor. Graham exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. Then perhaps this isn't the right platform for you. Implication was clear. Meghan stood. The movement sent a visible jolt through the room. Gasps echoed as she smoothed her dress, her face composed but her eyes blazing. Thank you for confirming exactly what I thought, she said. This isn't about conversation, it's about control. And this, Graham replied coolly, standing as well, is where we end it. 8. Turned slightly toward the camera, his tone unmistakably final. We're going to take a break. The band hesitated, unsure whether to play. Meghan didn't wait. She turned and walked off stage, her heels striking the floor with sharp, going finality. The audience sat in stunned silence as the cameras faded, aware they had just witnessed something rare, a moment when charm failed, patience snapped, and live television slipped beyond anyone's control. You're about one question away from making a very big mistake. Meghan's words landed softly, but they carried weight, controlled, deliberate, and unmistakably threatening. The kind of warning delivered not in anger but in certainty. Graham replied, his voice rising to meet her edge without flinching. And what mistake would that be? He tilted his head slightly, curiosity masking defiance. Asking you what everyone else is already thinking, added calmly. Meghan laughed, but there was no humor in it this time. The sound was sharp, almost brittle, echoing awkwardly through. The studio, no, Graham, she said, forgetting that you're not untouchable. The silence that followed was deafening. The audience shifted in their seats, some uncrossing their legs, others glancing nervously toward the cameras as if unsure whether this was still part of the show. Even the laughter cues felt miles away. Now, no one dared to breathe too loudly. Graham leaned back in his chair, unhurried, his fingers steepled in front of his lips. He studied Meghan the way a chess player studies the board, calculating, patient, weighing risk versus reward. The playful host was gone entirely now. Touché, he murmured at last. But let's see how long you can keep this up. By now, the tension was unbearable. sat heavy in the room, pressing against everyone present. Meghan's sharp words had sliced cleanly through every polite boundary, but Graham's legendary patience, once unshakable, was visibly thinning. What? Had begun as witty banter had devolved into a battle of egos, raw and unfiltered. And while many expected sparks, no one expected just how far Meghan would push her, how Graham would respond when pushed back. The studio felt like it was holding its breath. Meghan sat rigidly on the famous red sofa, her arms now crossed defensively, eyes flashing with restrained fury. The carefully curated poise she'd entered with was cracking, replaced by something harder, sharper. Graham, usually so effortlessly unflappable, sat in silence opposite her. His trademark smirk replaced with a thin line of irritation, even the audience who had arrived expecting laughter. Gossip and charm were now afraid to cough. "Well," Graham finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. "At least we can agree on one thing. You're consistent, consistently combative." Meghan let out a sharp laugh. "You're hilarious." Graham, a man who's made a career out of needling guests, thinks I'm combative. How original. He raised an eyebrow. "Not original, Meghan. Just accurate." She tilted her head, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, do you get a medal every time you insult a guest? It's just enough to make headlines, but not enough to get canceled? Is that how this works?" The audience gasped. A few nervous chuckles escaped before dying instantly. Graham's lips twitched, but not into a smile. "Oh, don't flatter yourself," he replied coolly. "I've had far more challenging guests than you." Meghan leaned forward, closing the physical distance between them. Her voice dropped low dangerously. "Quiet, the kind of quiet that cut deeper than shouting. I'm sure you have," she said. "But tell me how many of them left this stage wishing they'd never agreed to come here?" Graham's jaw flexed ever so slightly. He adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate slowness before responding, a clear signal that his patience was hanging by a thread. The ones who confuse accountability with cruelty usually do. For the briefest moment, Meghan faltered. Just a flicker, but she recovered quickly, her voice rising, sharpened by indignation. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You're not holding anyone accountable here. You're just another cynical old man pretending to stay relevant by tearing people down." The words hung in the air like smoke. You could hear a pin drop. Even the band stopped fiddling with their instruments, frozen mid-movement. Somewhere backstage, a producer pressed a hand to their mouth. Graham's gaze hardened. "Cynical?" he repeated softly, but there was nothing soft in his tone. "You're calling me cynical?" Meghan didn't blink. "That's right. Cynical, jaded, bitter. Take your pick." His nostrils flared, just slightly. "Better cynical than sanctimonious." Meghan's cheeks flushed, but her lips curled into a faint, defiant smile. "Cute, Graham, really? Trying to turn this around on me?" She gestured vaguely toward the audience. "Is that what you do when things stop going your way? Flip the script and hope people clap?" "This isn't about applause," Graham snapped. The sudden sharpness startled even the front row. "It's about honesty. Honesty. Honesty." She shot back. "You wouldn't recognize honesty if it walked onto this stage without a punchline." The audience collectively inhaled. This was no longer television as usual. This was personal. Graham leaned forward now, matching her posture, his voice low and firm. "You came here knowing exactly who I am and what I do. If you wanted a monologue, there are plenty of cameras happy to give you one." "And you invited me here knowing exactly what you'd provoke," Meghan replied. "Don't pretend this wasn't calculated." "Everything on television is calculated," Graham said. "The difference is, most guests understand that. Or tolerate it," she countered. Another pause, another loaded silence. Graham straightened, looking directly into the camera for the first time since the exchange began. "I think," he said carefully, "we're reaching a point where this conversation isn't productive." Meghan's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, are we done already?" "No," he said. "We're at the point where respect becomes non-negotiable." Scoffed. "Respect? You lost that 10 minutes ago. You've been testing it ever since," he replied. The tension peaked, stretched tight as wire. Everyone could feel it. This was the moment where something had to give. Meghan leaned back, folding her arms again. You know what, Graham? You win. Congratulations, you got your headline. Graham didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was calm, resolute, and you got your warning. The room froze. For a split second, Meghan looked as though she might stand again. Then she exhaled sharply, shaking her head. This, she said quietly, is exactly why people don't trust media anymore. And this, Graham replied just as quietly, is why interviews aren't therapy. The cameras kept rolling. The audience sat stunned. In that moment, it was painfully clear. The charm was gone, the masks had slipped, and live television had crossed a line it could never quite step back from. Graham shifted in his chair, no longer bothering to disguise his irritation. The playful host, the man known for diffusing tension with a raised eyebrow and a well-timed joke, was gone. Oh, trust me, he said coolly. I've got plenty left. Then, Meghan made the mistake that changed everything. You know, she began, her voice sharpening into open mockery. I can see why you've never really made it beyond this sofa. A ripple of unease swept through the studio. Too scared to do anything real, she continued, warming to her point. Too scared to actually create something of your own. Easier to just sit here, safe and comfortable, sniping at people who've actually risked something. The audience gasped in audible, collective intake of breath. Graham's eyes narrowed to slits, his usually rosy cheeks draining of color. For a moment he said nothing, as though restraining something dangerous. Just beneath the surface, you think sitting here isn't real? He said finally, his voice low, but vibrating with anger. You think what I do has no value? He leaned forward slightly, each word deliberate. That's rich, he added. Coming from someone who's turned victimhood into a brand. Meghan's eyes widened and then she laughed. It wasn't laughter born of humor. It was sharp, cutting, almost startling in its suddenness. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, operators unsure whether to zoom or pull back. Oh, there it is, she said, still smiling. The truth at last. She gestured vaguely around the studio. You just can't stand that I walked away. It still became bigger than you'll ever be. Graham's voice rose now, breaking from its careful restraint. Even the producer standing at the edge of the stage stiffened. You think walking away makes you brave? He snapped. You think abandoning responsibility and then crying about it makes you admirable? That was when Meghan stood. The movement was sudden, defiant, electric. The audience collectively recoiled, several people audibly murmuring in shock. She loomed now, no longer seated safely on the red sofa, no longer contained by studio etiquette. You don't get to talk to me like that, she hissed. You don't know me, Graham, and you don't know when to stop, he replied, evenly though his voice now carried an unmistakable chill. He rose too. They stood facing each other. Civility. Meghan crossed her arms tightly and took a step closer. You're pathetic, she said flatly. Graham smiled faintly, but the smile never reached his eyes. And you're finished. The crowd audibly gasped. Even the studio lighting seemed to dim slightly, as if the room itself had sensed that something irreparable had just occurred. Meghan's fists clenched at her sides. Caught with merciless clarity, you'll regret this. Oh, my dear, Graham replied just as quietly. I already do. Charged, the audience was frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing television history or a professional collapse unfolding in real time. Toe-to-toe now was no longer about wit or reputation. It was pride, wounded egos, and control. Neither blinked. Neither yielded, but even the fiercest storms have an end, and when it came, it was brutal. Nobody in that studio would ever forget what happened next. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Meghan's arms remained crossed, her gaze unwavering, though her breathing had grown sharp and audible. Graham's hands rested on the back of the red sofa, knuckles white, jaw locked so tightly, a muscle twitched near his temple. From the audience, someone coughed nervously. Another whispered, "Oh my God," under their breath. The cameras stayed fixed, unblinking, catching every flicker of tension like a predator stalking prey. Then Graham straightened. Something had shifted. The irritation, anger, even the wounded. Pride drained from his face, replaced by something far more dangerous. Clarity, authority, finality. This was no longer a man sparring for control of a conversation. This was a host reclaiming his stage. His expression hardened. Calm and unmistakably resolute. "Meghan," he said, his voice steady, carrying easily through the studio, "this conversation is over." A stunned murmur rippled through the audience. "This, and certainly not personal attacks," Meghan scoffed. "So that's it? You provoke me, then pretend to take the high road?" "I didn't provoke you," Graham replied. "I asked questions. You crossed lines?" She stepped forward again. "You don't get to decide that?" "I absolutely do," he said quietly. "Because this is my show." The words landed like a gavel. Graham turned slightly toward the camera, breaking the stare down for the first time. "We're going to take an early break," he announced. The band froze, unsure whether to play. "And Meghan," he added, turning back to her, his tone unwavering, "I think it's best if you leave the stage now." The audience erupted, not in applause, but in shocked murmurs, gasps, disbelief. Meghan stared at him, stunned. For the first time, the confidence faltered. "Just a crack." "Just enough. You're kicking me off?" she asked, incredulous. "I'm ending this," he replied, "before it gets any worse." For a long second, she didn't move. Then, with a sharp exhale, she shook her head. "This is exactly who you are," she said bitterly. "Small, afraid, hiding behind your platform." Graham didn't respond. Meghan turned abruptly, her heels striking the floor with sharp, echoing finality as she stormed off stage. Her posture was rigid, her dignity hanging by a thread. The cameras followed her for half a second, then cut back to Graham. He stood alone beside the red sofa, the symbol of countless light-hearted moments now tainted by silence. The audience sat stunned, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or remain frozen. Graham took a breath. "We'll be right back," he said quietly. The lights dimmed. The band finally began to play, hesitant and subdued, and as the screen faded, one thing was clear to everyone watching. They hadn't just seen a bad interview. They had witnessed the moment when charm gave way to judgment. When live television slipped beyond anyone's control and when a guest walked out of one of the most iconic shows on British television, leaving behind a silence that would echo long after the cameras stopped rolling.